Thanks, Cardi.
Well, hey there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you for that introduction about AWA. There are pieces of that I did not know. So I just learned something. Thank you very much. Lee and I are here to tell you a little bit about Agile transformation. He and I were brought in a couple of years back there was a group, engineering group that was struggling with their Agile practice and looking for consistency. And they brought us in to try to help. And we gave some guidance, and then they said, hey, your guidance sounds pretty good. Would you mind sort of taking it over? And so Lee and I jumped in with both feet and went to work on it. So that's what we're going to tell you about today. So let me tell you first a little bit about ourselves. My name's Arjay Hinek. I started in project management back in the late 80s. I was very frustrated as a project manager, and then found Agile about 15 years ago and found that it provided sort of a framework for a lot of the things I was trying to make projects do. I do have quite a few certifications. I have 2 or 3 from AWA. So I'm pleased to hear that there's that great interconnection. I don't have certifications because I like to have pile up letters behind my name. I like to do certifications because I like to learn. If there's anything I'd like to have, as far as letters, it would be LLL, lifelong learner, behind my name, because that's really my mindset. And I'm very curious all the time, and that curiosity has served me well, particularly in working with teams, and especially in working with challenging organizations or challenging issues. And so this opportunity we're about to tell you about presented all that. I'll turn it over to Lee now.
Thanks, Arjay. So, hey, everybody, my name is Lee Griffin. I am based out of Waterford in Ireland, and a very similar and shared journey to Arjay, deeply rooted in being a lifelong learner. And, you know, I have countless certificates. I like to joke the kids were having alphabet soup the other day, and I spotted a couple of my certificates in there from the acronyms. But I just want to highlight a couple of them here. So I came from a PhD background in computer science, and that was my first exposure to Agile. How the hell do you run a multi-year project with key deliverables? And I adapted Scrum, right, for my way of working. And that actually led me later to look at a concept called small scale Scrum, where we could try and make Scrum work for 1 to 3 people. And I pulled Arjay in to help me shape that from a partner in crime. My knowledge around Agile, I always felt was incomplete, right? Like I misaligned myself and called myself a coach when I wasn't. And it led me to really deeply investing in that path. So I went down the route of certified team coach with Scrum Alliance, and that's when Arjay and I really got together and formed a partnership for a shared journey and support of each other. And I went even further down the coaching route with ICF and got my PCC recently. But I've actually broadened my horizons because the limitation, I believe, in software and Agile is the fact it's only 20-something years old. So I stepped out of that and looked at Lean, which has a huge storied history going the whole way back to Venice, for how they went and built ships back in the 1600s, right up to what folks would be more familiar with Toyota in the early 1900s. I like to call myself a change agent for organizations. Irrespective of the role or what I'm doing, I try to change the organization and try to promote better ways of working. And I've recently stepped in to try and help Red Hat drive their research initiatives, particularly around AI. And we'll hit a little of that towards the end of the call. But let's talk a little bit about Red Hat, because a lot of people might not be so familiar with Red Hat. They might just have Linux in their mind, and you'd be 100% correct to say that. We were founded in 1993, and Linux was really our gig and our jam at the time. But we have grown tremendously since then, and we operate a lot in the hybrid cloud space, really working with the Fortune 500, which would be our main user base. And the majority of applications that you interact with, somewhere in the background, there's a piece of Red Hat technology. We are an open source company, and the long-standing joke I like to tell people when introducing what Red Hat is, we sell free software. And it's very hard to get your head around that, how you can be a multi-billion-dollar company that sells free software, but we sell it by the value adds of the security, the provenance of the software that you have, the hardening of it to make it enterprise grade, and it mitigates the risk for those trusted partners that we have. And we were acquired in 2019 by IBM. It was the largest technology acquisition in history for $34 billion in cash. The only asset they got was our logo. Everything else was about people, culture, and mindset, which I think speaks volumes for what we're going to talk about today. But because we are deeply entrenched in an open source mindset, we have this concept of the open organization. And there's a lot of free material out there, free as in beer, as the saying goes, from the book about the open organization. But there's two areas I really want to highlight here. The first is the open decision framework, which you're going to hear a little bit about in the next 10, 15 minutes. And the second is the open practice library. The OPL is a collection of tools and techniques that you can use in any of your teams. It's a wonderful library. It has been collated by very passionate people, and we always want new contributions. And it's a great resource for you to go to if you're stuck with your team or stuck for an idea for how to run a facilitated session or a retrospective or whatever challenges you might face. So that's the breakneck tour of who Red Hat are.
All right. Thanks, Lee. I kind of rushed you through that. I apologize for that. But let's get moving forward here. This image is a long and winding road, and I think it kind of captures what Lee and I have been through and what we're going to share with you today. So as Lee mentioned, this is about the open decision framework. So we're going to tell you a little bit about that, how it works, and how we used it. We're going to tell you about our leadership strategy, what came out of that open decision, and how it led to us developing a strategy for a very large organization's agile transformation. And I think we learn more from mistakes and accidents and pitfalls than we do anything else. And so we're going to share those with you, the pitfalls that we encountered, and also how we responded to some of them. We're going to tell you a little bit more about that culture generation, because I think that's at the root of any good transformation. And then we'll tell you about some of the disruptors of the future. We're going to talk a little bit more about AI and how that fits into this if you're going to pursue an agile transformation in the future, and things you might want to keep your eyes open for. And then, of course, we'll wrap it up with what are the big ideas? What are the central points that we want you to take away from this? So if you do one of these transformations on your own, or someone brings you in and asks you, what should we be watching out for? You're going to have some good answers and even hopefully some good anecdotes.
And I think this is a good point to pause and really level set here before we get into the main talk. So Arjay mentioned pitfalls. We're going to talk about challenges. And I like to play the prime directive card here, right? There is no blame in this. This is a blameless review of what we've done. If anything, we're very critical of ourselves and the decisions and maybe the missed opportunities. But you'll hear us talk about leadership, about teams, and this is no way disparaging to them as individuals or their way of working. We like showing a warts and all view, because I personally find that the most informative when you stand up in front of an audience and don't just tell everyone it's green fields and blue skies and everyone is happy, right? There are real challenges. And to reflect on the Lean link that I mentioned earlier, Lean is running for over 100 years. They have huge amounts of research and data for long-lived transformations of organizations. And the actual success rate is under 10%. So I just want to frame that for going into this, right? That we'll talk about gaps and mistakes and problems, but we're consistent with what the literature says, right? And there's a learning outcome from this. But the first thing I want to chat about here, and this is the most understated phrase we're going to use today, bringing people on a change journey is difficult. And you could replace the word difficult with a lot more adjectives and it would still be very apt and still very descriptive, but I am recorded and I promise that this would be a nice, friendly conversation and no swearing. And here's the reality: when you're bringing people on a change journey, it's often a forcing factor, right? So something is driving why this journey needs to happen. And for us, it was very simple. We wanted to ship our products to our customers quicker, but at the same quality, right? And that's a very, very succinct decision for why we want to do it. And these strategic decisions often have to be made. Sometimes they're made in a vacuum. And teams might not be ready for this. They might not feel that they have to go on a transformation because they're working really well. And some teams just might not want to move this way. Why would my product move when it's and they'll insert a description for why their product can't move. It could be a bug-facing product. It could be approaching end of life. We always work this way. And it's a very holistic change because it's culture, mindset, and behavior. And it brings the question to Arjay. Well, where do we start, Arjay, when we do this?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Lee. We were brought in to try to help, and we heard a lot of stories, and we gathered a lot of information. But as you'll see, went in a lot of different directions. So one of the things that Lee did, I think, rather masterfully, and I don't even work for Lee, I'm just telling him, just saying that out loud. He got the idea, why don't we eat our own dog food, and why don't we use the open decision framework? That's a framework that's built within the company. I guess it's over almost a decade ago, and it's expanded and contracted. It's been used in many different groups. And Lee said, why don't we use the structure for it to pull everybody together to actually talk about this? And so I'll let Lee talk a little bit more about the actual open decision framework, but its main tenets are inclusivity, being transparent at all time, thinking of your customer, think of the community, open exchange participation, and releasing early and often. And I know those are all great buzzwords, but the bottom line is there's a very set structure of let's agree on what the problem is we're trying to solve. Let's pull the people together. Let's first define it. Let's identify who's going to be the actual person who is the decision maker. And it just speeds things along. The idea is to get people to, even if you don't agree, at least you get to have had your voice in it. And well, I'm stealing some of Lee's thunder on this, but Lee brought it up, so I'm going to turn it back over to him now.
Perfect. And the reason we wanted to go down the ODF route, and the reason I saw this as an opportunity, in any decision, you just can't please everyone. It would be foolish to think that you're going to get 100% of people with this decision. And Charlie mentioned earlier about engagement, right? And this is something I'm very familiar with. If you look at all the Gallup studies that have been done, roughly 30% of your org are engaged, roughly 10% are disengaged. They're the people that you just know you can't get the message through. They could be annoyed, they could be angry, they could be close to retirement, they've just switched off. But it's that middle 60% or so that you're targeting when it comes to raising awareness for a decision. And what the open decision framework gives you fundamentally is transparency and visibility. It's giving visibility into the requirements that we have, the problem statement that's been put forward, the constraints, what we can solve, what we can't solve. So even us putting into that ODF document that we can't go and hire 100 Agile coaches and solve this, that we can't go and pause all product development so that we can achieve our goals of transforming the organization. It sets out any hypotheses we have. It gets all assumptions out on the table. What the approach for the validation of the decision, the evaluation criteria is going to be. And it's really just a chance for people to feel heard, right? That they have a chance to put in their feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. And the real big one for me is this removes the surprise element from the equation. Jimmy has helpfully dropped the link for the ODF in. It's a wonderful document, very, very simple to use and work through. In truth, this is a full talk, and I done that talk at Scrum Alliance's gathering last year. I'll try and root out the link. It's escaping me at the moment. And it talks you through the mechanics of what each phase does, what it looks like. But we ultimately done this to embark on a journey of feedback to move us forward as an organization. And Arjay is going to give a brief insight into that.
Yeah, so the group came together. Actually, there was hundreds of people volunteered, but to actually have a discussion. But they narrowed it down to 18, and that 18 people met in person in Boston and had this discussion. And Lee led them through the open decision framework, led them through the various stages of it. It was a full week's worth of workshops. And as they moved along, the group realized that the overall problem could be divided into multiple pieces. They knew that if we needed to, if this 5,500 people were going to move forward in Agile transformation, we needed something closer to a unified backlog that is working from a common source so that we'd have a source of truth. The idea of continuous improvement and clear roles and responsibilities as well as education and training, though I kind of wish we'd call it education and mentoring. I've never loved the word training because it suggests, I don't know, you train your dog, you don't train people. But anyway, I digress. One of the key elements out of it all, though, was the sense of we needed to, let's go back and look at our principles and our values. I mentioned it very briefly earlier that the idea of culture is central to a transformation. So we kept that in mind at all times. And for that to happen, you've got to make sure everyone's aligned on their values and their principles. Jimmy, one of the great guys, he served as sort of the voice or the open office office hours person in EMEA, and I served as the open office hours person here in the United States. And so every week we would invite people in, just have this open time to come in and comment or discuss or even argue about what should our principles be and what should our values be. And ultimately, we ended up with a document with 460 people were engaged at different times. We had comments, seemingly constantly, and Jimmy and I would respond to them, try to shape the conversation, or if it reached critical mass where we had a big disagreement, we would pull everybody together and we'd try to do some sort of workshop. What was really curious about it, though, is we had asked for values originally. We said, hey, share with us what you think our values are as an engineering group. And what everyone kept giving us was a list of principles, because the people were not thinking in terms of the kind of theory of values. They were thinking in terms of what are some concrete examples of what we do. So we ended up with something like 44 different principles. Well, you can't list out 44 principles and say that's what you believe in. Curiously, we used AI and we plugged those in and asked ChatGPT. So based on these 44 principles, what looks like our core values? And the most curious thing happened. It came back with 5 core tenets, and then the group looked at it and said, I don't agree. I think there's something missing. So ChatGPT, maybe it got it right, maybe it got it wrong, but the core tenet was that we realized, okay, there's something we do believe in, and these principles represent most of it, but not all of it. So that's how we distilled it down and landed on our principles and values. We essentially rewrote the Agile Manifesto. In fact, many of the principles from the original Agile Manifesto, we pretty much ported straight over. So, but there are quite a few that are also very particular to the current state of the world.
So Arjay, just go back to the last slide, because we do have 1 or 2 questions which I want to take as we go. But before I do that, I want to draw to the number. We had 460 people engaged, and we had the 18 or so, it actually grew to about 24 in the end, that worked on the ODF. So all in, we had close to 500 people actively engaged in this process out of 5,500 people. That was approximately the organization size at the time we were on this journey. And you might be thinking that's a small number. This was the active participation, right? These were people that were actively putting their hand up to give opinion, to join our meetings, to chat to us about it. But the visibility across the organization, impossible to capture, because we have multiple chat tools, there's emails, there's reporting statuses, and 100 other ways that people communicate. And it goes to the comment that I think was Corin mentioned in the chat. What was the surprise element that was removed? That was it. That we are going on this transformation, that here's what the problem is, here's what the objectives and the goals are. And it opened it up transparently that this is for everyone. And now is the chance to have your say and to voice your concern or whatever it may be. Dan asked, could we speak to how we got so many people engaged for a week of workshops, and was it a week solid or partial? It was 4 full days in Boston to allow people to travel there. It was on Halloween. I missed Halloween in Salem, which would have been a lifelong goal for me to get over there, but we managed to get people there because there was budget and willingness. They done a process where there was an open call to arms for the organization, for anyone that was interested and passionate about Agile, to volunteer themselves to join this initiative. They got over 100 applicants, and they selected 18 initially, and as I said, that grew as time went on as we brought expertise in. But those folks that were chosen were from the diversity of backgrounds and experience and product areas, to make sure that we got a stage where the people representing and advocating it were representative enough of the diversity in the organization. So that's how we got people there. Their management were supporting it. I believe the ask was 20 to 30% of someone's time for the 3 months it was on. It was closer to 50%. And management were very supportive of that because they knew the importance of it. So keep asking questions in the chat, and one of us will keep an eye and try and bring it in. But this is what we've done from that initial engagement. And I just want to hone in on this part in particular. We constantly shared, discussed, and presented, right? So nothing was kept locked in a document. We made every effort. Arjay mentioned the office hour format that we had, and we engaged one-on-one with people, and especially those giving deep feedback. And the feedback we got from those people were fantastic. They've been burnt on previous transformations. They hadn't been listened to. They were highly opinionated. They had a lot of knowledge. And it really helped us dig into the nuances of trying to do this across a huge organization. We attended team calls where we could. We went and joined leadership calls. So we have the concept of staff and extended staff calls in Red Hat, where you typically would have a manager at the top of the pyramid with his or her managers underneath them. And we joined as many as we physically could. We done one-to-one invites to get our leadership. When I say leadership here, I talk about our real senior VPs and SVPs to come into the documents and provide feedback. Again, just so we could get people engaged. And we molded a set of outcomes across those 3 to 4 key objectives that we could call V1. And we wanted to iterate on that, and we had to form a plan to go and grow and evolve that. And that was one of our key outcomes, is that we wanted this to move forward and not just be a one and done thing that we leave on the shelf.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, so I feel like I'm realizing that I have a lot of the negative stuff in this presentation, but it's negative because it's things that we came to realize and things that we missed. And so there was some things, the question sort of hint at it, is this level of, there was a certain amount of disconnect. We did reach out. We did have hundreds of people volunteer, and we had 18 people very invested. But there is that natural tendency, if you're a successful Agilist, or if you've got a successful set of teams, you kind of want to be left alone, because you don't want some big thing coming in and changing the way everybody works. And I think that was part of the problem, is that the message was that we were there to change everyone. Some people felt excluded because they didn't get the message about this event or about this effort for the ODF. Many had this idea of, don't touch my stuff, we're doing fine, just please leave us alone. They missed the message that this is not about changing everyone, but getting those who are successful the opportunity to share what it is that they've done to be successful. But so those are the negatives, but generally a much larger percentage was people were excited about this. They liked the idea of leveling, of getting some sort of standards, or some a sense of now I'm losing the word, but just that consistency is the word I'm looking for. And they also like the idea of breaking down silos, like get those successful groups to share what's working for them, what's the differentiator that allowed them to be successful. In many cases, it's the leadership, and also in many other cases, it's just broad general understanding. So there was, it wasn't just a super happy path. We definitely had some hiccups here and there, and some areas to work with, and to pull people in and say, all right, share your knowledge, please. This is not about changing you. This is about getting everybody on the same page. And the rising tides raises all boats idea. So Lee and I set to work developing what we thought was going to be a strategy that met all of those challenges.
So the ODF, as an output from the group, because we were resolute after spending 3+ months of our lives on this, that this can't just gather dust and be an artifact on the shelf. And, osmosis won't get you to an agile transformation. So we wanted to inform a structure to carry this forward. And again, 5,500 associates split across multiple core products, think 30+ products. And within those products, you have a hell of a lot of teams. But if you really look holistically at that, every one of those organizations, they had unique needs, unique demands, unique commitments, from our trade shows, which is Red Hat Summit, through to commitments we've made to meet regulatory requirements or meet customer needs. And the teams, to their absolute credit, they had various maturity levels in practice, right? So some teams were several years into a journey. Some products were several years into a journey. You had domain experts scattered across the organization that done their best to connect and try and share that knowledge and that passion. And some of these teams had various levels of support. They had full-time Agile coaches. Other teams had project management and program management. And in Red Hat, they were kind of blurry, where they all tried to improve what they were working on. So not the traditional project or program managers from a waterfall perspective. And what emerged from this was a potential structure that we could succeed and grow into. And Arjay is going to take us through that.
Yeah, we referred to it as the hub and spoke model. And Lee and I actually didn't come up with this. The senior vice president suggested this idea of a hub and spoke, but Lee and I decided to dive into it and give it some meat and make it a little more clear what really was meant. And each of the product lines were the spokes, and out on the ends of those spokes were, we wanted to get an Agile person, and we call them the spoke leads, who would lead their spoke in their own Agile transformation to allow for that certain amount of malleability to fit the different product lines. But at the center would be the product owner, that's Lee, and the scrum master, if you will, or Agilist, that would be me, and as well as a whole support team. And the idea was that as problems arose out in the outer spokes, they would share it inward, and we would come up with what would be a good solution. The true core, the Agile idea behind it was, let's build a backlog of these problems, what they are, what are the biggest problems, what could we act on. Lee acting as product owner, thinking in terms of, okay, what would be the most impactful product for us to work on, and then share it back out. And then the spoke leads would then propagate that throughout their the tech area. We need those people to be passionate and agile, truly agile minded, and experts wherever we could have them. We wanted them to promote it within their own spoke, but also as they learned more, bring it back, and we could just recirculate. Think about it in terms of almost like a breathing. It's send it out, find out what's happened, experiment with it, and bring it back. So that was the model that we thought we would work with. And this what ultimately we called them the Agile Vision Leadership Team, and then they eventually became the Agile Leadership Team. I feel like I skimmed through that pretty quickly, but we are running a little long, so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Lee.
Cool. And the one thing that's very hard to show diagrammatically there is the interspoke communication. And I joked about this only yesterday. You leave engineers name things, we would have called that a token ring topology rather than a hub and spoke. But hub and spoke was more clicky and resonated with people. I want to talk about community practices for a few moments, right? So Red Hat has this strong culture of a COP model where you get like-minded people that will come together and work and collaborate and share knowledge around a thematic area. And we have COPs for Agile and DevOps, coaching, project management. We discovered process mapping was one there. And there's also concepts around music and gaming and, just a social connection for people. And this was going to become important because it was going to feed into our strategy. And our strategy here was to really mirror the upstream downstream relationship from open source. So apologies for folks that aren't familiar with this. I'll give a brief overview. So in open source, you have what are known as communities where people from a volunteer perspective contribute code, ideas, and that's called upstream. And typically what forms from an upstream community is a downstream product, which consumes the material in the upstream community. It hardens it, it adds more value to it, but it feeds back to the upstream all of the improvements, and it creates this virtuous cycle. And this is the classic open source paradigm. And the intention we had here from the Agile DevOps COP is that would become our upstream, where all of the passionate people that are doing all of the cool Agile things, from tips and tricks and practices to training material to means of engagement, would contribute that to the upstream, and a downstream team or product that is only starting on the journey or struggling with a part of the journey would be able to fork or pull from that upstream, apply it to their own teams, harden it, modify it, break it, learn something from it, and feed that back in. And again, it creates that virtuous cycle. And that was something that obviously resonated really well with a software-oriented team used to working in this manner. but of course we had to have some pivots to that plan.
Yes, indeed we did. And one of the challenges with the community mindset, or using an upstream and downstream community cycle, is that you've got to have enough people, right? You've just got to have enough bodies involved. And if it's too small, it just doesn't have that, it doesn't quite resonate. And that was one of the challenges we had. But we, moving forward though, we had other things that we had to pivot on. We had, this idea of no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. It's a Helmut von Moltke, I think, was the person who first said that. But Dwight Eisenhower used the expression, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And I think that's what really happened here. Lee and I came up, we did the planning, we did the work, we shared it out so that people would better understand the plan. But as Mike Tyson has very famously said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And sure enough, we were punched in the mouth pretty quickly, not out of malice. It wasn't anybody being mean. It was just the nature of doing business. Change is inevitable. We knew it was coming, but there were a number of things that occurred that sort of, I wouldn't say derailed, but made us pivot frequently. We'd formed our backlog based on everything that came out of the ODF and that ALT that it began to form. We started forming that backlog. We decided to pilot this idea of pilot in a small space and see what would happen, learn from it, and then share it out some more. That was the original plan. But as time moved on, a few things impacted us. There was some misunderstandings. We'll talk a little bit more about those earlier, about what we mean when we say team. But then there were other problems, and that was including workforce reduction. The early 2023 hit a lot of tech companies hard, and Red Hat was not, didn't miss that either. And so we lost a number of people who were part of our original core plan. And so we had to pivot yet again. And then organizational priorities changed. The market and the business changed in general. So there was a lot more focus on some of the products that suddenly everyone had agreed we were all going to work together on this agile transformation. And then suddenly certain products were like, not right now. I got to hold off. We've got big pressures. We've got to get some things out the door. And then there's also, Red Hat has Red Hat Summit every year. It's a big deal. And a lot of things were focused for Summit. And suddenly we found as the year went on, we're getting closer to Summit, and other teams had to peel off and say, I'm sorry, I can't participate. So I've got to pull out of this as well. So just some of the questions in the chat about like, how did you get everybody involved? Well, early on, we had a lot of leadership agreement, but as time went on, perhaps we took too long, or perhaps people didn't understand the magnitude of the effort, but it did impact the way people got involved. People had to peel out, and we had to adjust accordingly.
And to give some context and timelines here, we had approximately 3 months for the ODF phase. We then had a 6-month bootstrapping effort, and including in that were all of the pivots that Arjay spoke about. And it got to a point where we had to make a serious pivot, that the original plans, I traveled over to Raleigh, we got into a room, we had whiteboard sessions galore, we killed a couple of sticky notes as well. And it gave us a direction, but we had to pivot towards a different strategy. And instead of having one strategy to rule all of the products, we went for 8 strategies, right? And you need to hear it out though. We wanted a dual strategy model where every spoke had their own strategy for their own opportunities, their own problems, and to reflect where they were on their own maturity curve. But then have an overarching strategy where we would all take on common challenges and common problems and hence common opportunities. And that way we could gain the insights from spokes that were a little bit more advanced versus spokes that were a little bit behind in certain areas, and look at how we could create those natural relationships. But this would satisfy that challenge of my product is too busy in months April, May, and June. So we will step out, in air quotes, but we'll focus on something else without feeling the pressure for the overall team to perform. And to complement that, the leader voice was one of the challenges that we came up with. So on the next slide, you'll see one of the challenges here is organizations, particularly enterprise level, they have what's known as a matrixed hierarchy. So what I mean by that is, to build out your product, you typically have to have someone from engineering, from user experience, from quality engineering, from security, right? I could keep going. And they typically have different matrixed hierarchies where they report to different leaders. And we did identify key relationships to represent those hierarchies, but there's a distance of several hops between the top of the tree leader, their next level of management, their next level of management, and the whole way down to the lowest level of management. And sprinkled across that reporting line are the individual contributors. That's the fancy name for non-managers that we have. And where that creates a problem, if anyone can remember the playground games of where you'd tell a whisper to someone and a little story, you'd ask them to tell someone else and they'd tell someone else and so on. And after maybe 3 whispers, the story has changed. It's changed ever so slightly, or it could change absolutely dramatically. And this became real difficult for us, because how do you contextualize the word leadership, right? And it's impossible then to know the reach, the depth, and what they're interpreting from this. But we did have a true leadership, shall we say, right? Our most senior level. And we obviously have to look at what they need from a prioritization perspective. And that brought us to our first opportunity to deliver something across the organization.
And one of the things that Lee and I thought about when we were planning was, how will we measure success? And what we had looked at was, it turned out not to be the same idea of metrics that many in leadership were thinking. We knew that it was going to take a while for things to happen. It takes 6 months for a team to change, 5,500 people. It's going to take considerably longer. So instead of measuring how the impact of our Agile efforts on that 5,500 people, instead we were looking at more things in terms of culture change, in terms of people feeling frustrated or burned out, as well as just kind of a binary measurements of, are people doing something or are they not doing it? We were looking for outcomes, but there was a big focus on outputs. And because of that, we were even asked questions just a few weeks in of like, okay, so how much better are we now? Or how much better are things happening? And so that required some education, some difficult conversations around what we can and cannot measure. And I think that Lee kind of hinted at it, that with that whisper tree, as information got out, people would ask, oh, now they're asking for X, Y, and Z, and that created a sense of distrust. So we spent a good deal of effort trying to reinstill trust, because as they say, with trust, you get it in droplets, but you lose it in buckets. And so we were trying to plug any holes in any buckets. But there were some valid questions around, okay, so how do we measure this? Because I it's not that I dislike metrics. I just, they need to be messaged in a very careful way so that people understand what's being asked for and why it's being asked for. Ultimately, there was a shift at leadership. Everyone said, well, I keep hearing this question about estimation or points, or even just sizing our work so that we can do this better. And in the end, there was a mandate that came out that said, all right, everybody needs to start estimating. That was not the messaging process we would have liked to have followed, but ultimately now everybody is estimating. And I have been able to take that data, or some of that data, and share with leaders, okay, what are we doing with this? Let's make this the new message. This helps teams determine how they're doing for themselves, understanding where they might be having problems for themselves. This isn't a leadership thing to use on people. This is for the teams. And I think that's starting to resonate. And even more importantly, it's also, I shared the idea of the confidence interval for a team, their predictability. They could even use some of that data to project some short-term planning. And that helped also. It helped people slow down. Let's not keep asking for, are you estimating? What's your velocity? What's your velocity? What's your velocity? Instead, they're looking at it as, okay, the team is estimating. The team has data that tells them how they're doing. And it also gives them a sense of what is their throughput rate, so that they ultimately can make estimates. So I think it's really important that people talk about estimates versus commitments. And estimating work does get a team in the practice, good habit of doing that. We have some other things we're going to be working on as we move forward, but the baseline, we needed some sort of metrics to start with.
And we did achieve a hell of a lot, right? And I deliberately wanted to add these slides to it so that it's not a doom and gloom talk. Bootstrapping the Agile DevOps community, that was something that we worked closely with the leadership of it, because what you have to realize, we had no control over that COP. Not that we ever wanted control over it. We wanted the advocacy, the partnership, and the collaboration, because the COP is a neutral concept. So it's bringing people from our sales team, our marketing team, our engineering teams, and everything else underneath the Red Hat banner together in one area. So getting them on board was huge. We formed the concept of a continuous improvement champion, and we had a corresponding framework associated with it. The concept of a role like a CIC, it would be like a Scrum Master light duty, if we're to use Scrum analogies. So the concept here is that teams would have a continuous improvement champion that in turn would advocate for taking on continuous improvement actions within the team. That could be the simplest thing of having teams get together once a day for a chat, or to have commitment-based planning, or to have a retrospective. So you can see where this is an analogy to what a Scrum Master could and would do. And we wanted to make great continuous improvement champion. And this has been a resounding success, and really distributed that from a competency perspective across the organization. We also looked at baselining our org on a common maturity assessment. This is going back to Arjay's comment about having metrics, understanding where we are, and hence where we're trying to move towards. And what was interesting here, we discovered around a dozen different maturity assessment models that were deployed across the organization. Some were the likes of the Spotify model, and some were homegrown assessments. So by having a common maturity assessment, we were better able to look at the trends across the organization, and hence from an overall strategy that we were trying to pursue, make informed recommendations. We also managed to inform the design of what we call a unified backlog. So Red Hat uses Jira as a mechanism to capture all of our customer interactions, as well as several teams' worth of plannings. And we could spend an hour and a day debating the merits of Jira or other tracking tools, but we knew this was one of the immovables when we went to the ODF, right? We knew that Jira was the tool, we had invested in it, we built out a lot of automation, and it's where our communities and our customers interact. And we had all of those products that were interdependent on each other or layered upon each other, and how the hell do they all operate in one unified view of the world? But the biggest outcome, the biggest achievement from my perspective, we enabled autonomy. We didn't have a forced transformation. We didn't tell people they have to do X or Y. We encouraged, we looked at the culture generators, and we tried to get it to a point where teams were self-sufficient, but still felt connected to the bigger picture. And that is impossible to nail down. This is like putting Jello on the wall, right? You can put a nail through it, and how do you know it's going to hold up or what it looks like? And this is something that you just feel and you can sense from chatting to people. So to me, that was a big one, but we didn't recognize everything. And that's what Arjay is going to finish this section with.
Yeah. I see some questions popping in there. What would we do differently, or would we do something differently? And we're definitely going to talk about that a little bit here. But so there were some things that we did recognize when we started off, and these are the things that now going forward I would be keeping my eyes open for. One of those is this concept of uniformity of expectation and messaging. We had too many voices saying slightly different things, and I think we would have, if I had the opportunity to start this over again, I would have put a little more formal structure around our comms. Not because I love big, heavy duty, waterfall kind of mindsets at all, but because something this large, 5,500 people, definitely needs, it's a different communication style than you have with maybe 5 teams of, maybe 50 people tops. But when you get 5,500 people, a lot of things happen because you've got many layers of the communication chain. We assumed that there was buy-in from all levels. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit, some of the details of it, but we'll having all those layers that I was just describing. If that message hasn't been consistently delivered across, or there hasn't been a sense of buy-in, you're going to have problems. I think we considered that in the beginning, but we just didn't realize it was as big a problem as it ultimately turned out to be. Assumed oneness with the vision. It was promoted from from the senior vice president probably a year and a half prior to when we started, and everyone kept referring back to Tim's presentation, and it was over a year prior to when we started. And I think we needed to restate it. I think that would have been very helpful if we'd done that, because I think that would have, I don't know, reinvested everybody in what it is we're talking about. There was also some confusion around definition of team. When we said we want to have some teams involved, we were thinking of a team 7 plus or minus 3 or 7 plus or minus 2. Turned out that some people, a team was, well, all of the hundreds plus people who might be working on a particular project. That's, in my head, not a team. So when we said we need 7 teams, we ended up with a much larger body than we had originally planned for this idea of experimentation and iterate and then deploy. So yeah, those are some of the things that we came to recognize early. We're going to jump now into actually where things, the pitfalls, and these, you pay attention here, because these are the places where things where Lee and I know we missed it, and we want to work on it. But before we do that, let's talk about this. Open questions. What are the ingredients of rough order you would typically use to transform a team?
And I think we have such a lively chat going on right now. I think we can do this async just to keep us on time, because I would like to keep as much as we can at the end. So let's get folks' thoughts in. Like, what's the rough ingredients and the rough order you do for a team? Because the next open question is, how's that different to an organization of 5,500 people, right? And that's what we were grappling with and trying to figure out. So in the interest of keeping us on track, I'll keep an eye on the chat, and Arjay can do likewise. Let's pop into the chat what your ingredients are. What's the mix that you try and focus on in a team? Back to you, Arjay.
All right. Yeah, let's jump just keep going then. So one of the biggest pitfalls we ran into was I hinted at it earlier about the size of the teams, was the scope of who we were working with. First, it was the entire organization. And then Lee and I hit on, let's not try to do the whole thing. Let's do it in little pieces. But then, so that's where the idea of pilot teams came about. But then teams was not a universally understood term. So then it became, well, eligible teams, that will be the subsets of some of those groups. And then, as we mentioned much earlier about either timing or the market, then people became, their groups became too invested in other efforts. So they said, well, you go ahead with this agile transformation. We're going to work. We have some other things, so please leave my organization out of it. Then the idea of estimation got pushed back out, and it was all orgs and all teams. And with that kind of expansion and contraction, I will take full responsibility for this. We should have gotten control of the communications right away as soon as we saw it expanding and contracting like that. So if there's one thing I would do different, I would change our communications plans to match the size and that expansion and contraction.
I've waited 3 slides to put a Lord of the Rings reference in, and I've alluded to the one thing to rule them all, right? But this is something that came up really strongly. The more we dealt with different leadership teams, the message is so key. So distributed leadership is naturally distributed voices. Now, it does promote better decisions. It gives you that roundness. It gives you that different diversity in thinking, thoughts, culture, background, and so on. So absolutely not dismissing that. But it does slow things down, and it can lead to misinterpretations right through to how teams view what the original message is and how it applies to them. Because often, from a communications perspective, we have the concept of cascading comms, where you'll send a top-level communication that hits the whole organization. Then the next layer of that organization will send a follow-on to just their organization, contextualizing it a bit further. Then the next layer of management does the same thing, and so on. And this does lead to misinterpretations. And the layers of leadership that we were naturally exposed to were the spoke leads, which were the voice of transformation for that spoke, and hence had the command over the challenges and the opportunities and hence direction. But often those spokes had a dedicated Agilist team with multiple people wearing an Agile coach-like hat, and that was often led by someone else, right, from a matrix organization perspective. I've mentioned that at length, the org leadership, the classical hierarchical leadership that we have, but then we have the concept of a sponsor as a leader, right? Because the way Red Hat is set up, we're big on OKRs, we're big on commitment and accountability. So ultimately, someone was accountable for this. And our sponsor has to act in a leader capacity, but also wear a different hat to be the leader of their own organization. And then, of course, you have myself as a product owner trying to set a direction. And a colleague coined this term several years ago when talking about an agile transformation. This was in a startup kind of context. You need to be a benevolent dictator to control the communications, do what's right for the organization, and really get everyone in line with the messaging. Now, that is a next to impossible challenge when you're dealing with the scale of an enterprise and all of the issues that you encounter just from scale communications and distributed leadership. And of course, we had to make assumptions as we go on, and that is something that I think everyone has to face at some stage. And Arjay is going to walk us through the assumptions that we had.
Yeah. So at the core of this, I've hinted at it a number of times, was that there was this organizational initiative. It was okay, this is what we're doing. Tim mentioned it a year and a half ago in one of his presentations. And I even talked about it in the chat here, is the sense of need. I have a big proponent of the spine model. If you don't have an agreed upon sense of need for a change or a need for a transformation, you're going to be unsuccessful. And I wouldn't say we were unsuccessful, but I think we fought that for the rest of the time that we worked on moving forward with this transformation. Just because it's an initiative doesn't mean there's a shared sense of need. You've got to get consensus on that with the group. We fully understood the goal of what we were trying to do. Some of the things that we did early did move us forward, but and matched what the leadership intended, but we assumed we had probed and validated. We thought we had spoken to all the right people, but I think we had spoke to many of the same people and kept getting the same message back. You got to have a full variety. When you have something of this magnitude, you have to talk to a lot more people at a lot more levels. I think we spoke to senior leadership and we spoke to people on teams, but we didn't talk to people in between. And that was a big miss. That was a bad assumption. So we had assumed managers had been included in these conversations, but they hadn't. And we made sure that there were lots of communications, but lots of communications is not a substitution for quality of communications.
And I love this diagram. Right? I'm a gamer at heart. I've played games since childhood. And this diagram came out probably 15, 16 years ago. And it looks at the learning curve for popular MMO games. And the MMO games were at the height of their power around that time. And if you look in the bottom of it, there's this wonderful predictive curve for most MMOs where you have, your challenging period and it levels out and you get better. And then there was this really infamously difficult MMO called EVE Online. And it had this brilliant graphic. And I love looking at it, the little stick men, the crosses, the bulldozer going across the top. And it was just illustrating the challenge of trying to do something in a very challenging environment. And that game deliberately set itself to be that. And it's a wonderful analogy to what we're trying to do in a team via an org transformation, because looking at the chat, a lot of knowledgeable people, very passionate. You wouldn't be here given this time on a Tuesday to listen to us about our story if you didn't have this knowledge. And we all have our toolkit for transformations, where we're looking at the vision, the mission, the challenges of the organization, the challenges of the people, trying to be as client-driven as we can, making incremental change, inspect, adapt, all of the wonderful things that we've been trained to and are culturally ingrained in us. And typically, you're talking 6 to 8 months to see progressive change, and then 18 to 24 months is your typical maturity point. And that's been my own experience over several teams in different organizations. But to do this at an organization level, to turn that wheel, incredibly difficult. It's not universally recognized as such. When you look at one of the concepts we brought in, the continuous improvement champion, or aligning this concept of a community of practice, that's massive in the grand scale of things. But if someone is just looking as an outside observer and go, they haven't changed, they haven't done anything, that measurable impact and output can be really, really difficult. And it can be mentally impacting on the leadership as well, when they know that this is a vital ingredient to move forward. And it's impossible to quantify, right? How long it's going to take, or where we are in the journey. You have this wonderful map and this plan, and things change. But that creates immense pressure on all levels of the leadership, from the market segment through to the engineering leadership, through to the folks trying to drive the transformation. And the reality is, change, it just can't happen fast enough, right? It needed to be done yesterday. And some things that, on retrospective, we feel we got wrong was the explainability of what we were trying to do, because different levels of the orgs, they do need different comms. And we were trusting that the right messages was filtering down to not have an avalanche of messaging and communications. And our biggest learning outcome from this is not to skip the middle, right? Not to target just the boots on the ground, and not to target just the leadership. It's the management layer that help carry that message into one-on-ones and team meetings. That's the group that we, I won't say neglected, but underestimated, for the impact it could have on the transformation. Trying to explain the intention and the joined up nature of all of these small puzzle pieces that we were putting together to build towards a bigger picture, when nobody could see the wood from the trees. And that included us. When you're neck deep into transformation, that's very, very difficult to elevate. And of course, everyone that's done a transformation, you're familiar with concepts like the satire change curve, where you get worse before you get better, and you get worse and you get better. And if you get that at a minimum, it can be very demoralizing trying to explain where we are and where we're at. The inter-team alignment and the propagation in each spoke, that's something that was building towards being a really good thing, but something that we never got to really see through, right? We never got to see the true power of that connectivity of an open organization that's willing to share. And they were all willing to share. We just never got to the point of maturity in the 2 years we were running this, that has worked. But in 12 months' time, Arjay can come back and tell us that we're here, right? That we're after moving this forward. And that brings us to probably one of our biggest learning outcomes from this.
Yeah, the change communications process is absolutely central. We'll go through in the very end what are the five big bright things that we took away from this, but many of them come back to change communications. It's not surprising. Like project management, the biggest challenge in project management isn't all the forms, isn't Gantt charts. It's whether or not you've got good, clear communications. And a transformation is no different. When you've got something that's this complex and this big, all it takes is the smallest little confusion to throw it off. And a great example is, if you look in the chat, the amount of back and forth and different concepts and different ideas around estimation. As soon as higher leadership ignored the original plan and said, let's do estimation, we're going to make everybody do estimation. Look at the chat and see how many different opinions there are. That's exactly what happened in our situation as well. You have a million voices with a million experiences, lots of different perceptions of how it can be done. Many saying, no, this isn't for me. There were quite a few teams that were already estimating, but there were quite a few other teams who weren't estimating at all and were going off of gut. And because of that, that communication, everyone's going to now estimate, that didn't come from us. It wasn't clearly communicated. It just came down as a mandate more than anything. I think I wouldn't say derailed it, but it distracted everybody from the original concept of let's work on this agile transformation journey together. If you want to know more about change comms or change management, you can just Google change top 10 reasons for change comms. But there are just 4 central tenets to it, and that is organize your comms, and then so that you don't have multiple people stepping on one another. or saying things at the same time, or saying divergent things. Structure your message. Gets down to the what's in it for me portion of messaging, because a message to leaders is going to have a very different sound and very different content than the message to the team. If you tell a team, we have to do this because it's going to help us hit the bottom line, or it's going to X dollars by such and such a date, most people on the team, they don't really care that much about that. They want to know about what they're working on and why it's impactful, and vice versa. You got to also structure the frequency. Sometimes we had 8 messages coming out from 3 different sources, all within a 2-week period. That just comes across as noise for a lot of people. So you've got to structure it so that you've got a good cadence of communications. You also have to have multiple methods. You don't want to use just newsletters. You don't want to use just emails. You've got to modify it. You've got to try a few different things and reach people from different angles, because everybody's different learning mindset, different approach to the way they engage in corporate communications. And so you've got to come up with a lot of different ways to do it. And finally, you always have to be orienting. I'm a big fan of the OODA loop, that concept of always be orienting. Particularly, and when you're communicating, if you send out 3 communications, you better stop and find out if they're having the impact you intended. And without a formal kind of structure in place for doing that, it's almost chaotic, and we did not have that good formal structure. So now let's get into culture generators. Now we get into things that are things that can work and you can use to help you. Lee mentioned the communities of practice across Red Hat. This concept, in fact, that's where Lee and I met as very many years ago, working in the Agile DevOps COP Agile coaching working group. And it's a great place to share ideas, to we refer to as peer-to-peer learning. You share ideas back and forth, kind of what we're doing here, right? Here's some things we learned. Here's some things we warn you about. So it's like, hey, make sure you don't do this. Those are great ideas within the company. And the hope was that the same concept we could keep using with this Agile transformation, right? We could get more groups sharing, not just within those spokes, but also externally, because you've got to have that relief valve where you've got this large community. People want to have these conversations. They want to talk about all the different ways that you might be able to estimate and what works best for them. And the idea is then for that to propagate back in, and it makes for a healthier community in the long run. I'm going to skim over this because we are running pretty long on time. So I'm going to go to the next one. The training pillar was part of this overall effort as well. There wasn't originally a training group. That was a team that wasn't a community of practice. And they had a vast amount of material, and they had a schedule of trainings that they were doing. And many teams would branch off of those. Thinking back to that community mindset, they would take those slide decks, or they'd take those trainings, and they would build it and cater it to their own group. Well, that left us with a massive amount of material out there, and a lot of different people who were doing training who weren't part of the original training team. So we pushed for this idea of a training pillar or the training working group, so that they could work on different efforts, and we'd have the different perspectives of people beyond just the original core team. They created things like bite-sized learning. They had cheat sheets, self-paced learning, and then even instructor-led training, kind of borrowing back from their original stable of material that they had.
Cool. We'll aim to finish in about 9 minutes, so we'll speed up the disruptor part. And this is really the last 2 slides of the core experience here. We found it hugely beneficial to engage with a training partner, and this is where AWA came in. We wanted to have a deep investment in key people, our coaches. We sent them on the IC Agile ICAC training. We got them trained up as Agile coaches, facilitators. We've had Scrum and Kanban training across the organization. And it is important to vary that, because the internal community of practice, they're wonderful people, hugely knowledgeable and passionate. But you look at a training partner, there's a standard they have to set themselves against, particularly for accredited training. It's consistency in learning outcomes, the Bloom's taxonomy approaches. But for me, it's an external voice. And this brings me to one of my historical pain points, is that when you're trying to drive a transformation, you risk being seen as a prophet in our own village. And this is a biblical phrase. And RJ, if you flip the slide, where no prophet is accepted in their hometown. And it's nothing truer than within an agile transformation. And external voices, they can avoid that. Bring someone in from outside your team, outside of your department, outside of your company. You'll get the same message with the same approach, and I can guarantee you'll get a different reaction. And I have wonderful stories here. A couple of years ago, I was advocating for 6 months for a Scrum team to hire a product owner. Couldn't get the advocacy. Saw a local conference, brought the 8 people that were the kind of senior leadership to the conference. And the following day, we had a rec approved to hire a product owner. So you often need that external voice. AWA were that for us, just to have the same message resonating differently. But find that, source that if you can. So look, we're going to round out this more to look at the future perspective and challenges from a disruptor point of view. Anyone working in tech, you're on a roller coaster. There's constantly new languages, new tools, new expectations, because we have a lot of disruptors within the enterprise, largely because of mobile phones and cloud services. They're now systems of engagement. More people are exposed to the technology landscape. And what you're battling for, you're trying to lead a transformation, but the team themselves are trying to go on a different transformation. They're trying to learn a new language, learn a new tool, maybe adapt the core tools they have. And that is just increasing pressure on the same people that you were trying to engage. And what we have now is the great disruptor of the modern times, which is artificial intelligence. And as you'll see on the next slide, LLMs, they're going nowhere. I could have pulled 10 different slides on this that would say the same thing. The market cap is growing exponentially out to 2030. All products want this dash of LLM magic. So product roadmaps are being ripped up and rewritten at a frightening pace, because the reality is the first to market on a particular product with AI will have a huge advantage. And all you have to look at is the explosion of ChatGPT in the last year, when you had companies silently working on AI for the last decade. They got the market first, and it's now a colloquial term. So this is coming. And just to speak at a very personal perspective, I was a developer a long, long time ago, and I explored a recent open source project because I'm trying to learn a little bit more about the capabilities of AI. And I implemented internationalization on an open source project. And with my ability going back a decade ago, this is probably about 8 days' work. Definitely needed help from QE, UX specialists, language specialists to deal with in Italian, German, French, Spanish. It took me 2 hours. And what was more frightening with this, that 2 hours was in a language I didn't understand. This was not wrote in a language that I had programming familiarity with. And I'm just sharing that to show the perspective from a developer, because by God, is that frightening, right? To know that your work could be replaced by someone in 2 hours. How do you adapt? How do you work towards it? And there's going to be an impact on Agile.
Yeah, the way our team, the way we've most, in fact, I'm willing to bet almost all of us here have worked with teams has been in the software space. As we move into AI, that model gets changed a little bit. In fact, there's the software development lifecycle for AI development. It gets tweaked. And so we're going to need to adjust for that as well, just as we had to adjust in our transformation to deal with a lot of the changes in business. Those of us who help work with teams or are working with multiple teams, we're going to have to think about what AI does to that. There's data-driven Scrum. That's a model that's been around a bit, but it focuses way more on the delivery cycle. We're measuring in terms of delivery rather than in terms of kind of a scrum or a sprint duration or time boxing. ML ops is going to be, I think the new machine learning operations is the new way of looking at DevOps, because we've got to think about the entire cycle, including the data preparation and the development and the model testing, and then ultimately deployment. And back in the days with software development, when we're done, we deploy it and then wait for bugs or discover bugs. Now there's drift and hallucination with the AI models that are out there, and so there's a constant attention that has to be given to the drift. Otherwise, you're going to end up with garbage. And so it's not nearly as deploy and wait. It's a far more cyclical, and you're going to have layers on layers as teams are working. So that changes the model slightly, and we as Agilists are going to need to change along with that. So when we consider a transformation, we've got to add now that new layer to it. So I'm going to skip past this, all right, Lee, and we'll just jump to our main learnings. Okay, so the short of it was that we asked AI about, what would you do if you were going to do a transformation, and ultimately it came back with many of the same answers that we came back with. So to wrap it up, bright ideas, things we learned. ODF is an excellent starting point, but it must be based on agreed upon long-range outcome. Lee, that was that was yours, the idea around the ODF. Let's make sure we have a long-range outcome in mind. Large transformation requires serious comms model. I know I referred to it as a comms process. A change management comms model is really what I meant. I apologize if I misspoke. Lee, I'll turn it over to you.
I mean, we obviously trust our leadership, right? And when everyone says they're on board, we still have to trust, but verifying is not a bad thing to do. Just taking that pause to pulse check, make sure we're all in sync, and make sure that we have the right buy-in and the right messaging. It's invaluable, and that is a massive takeaway for me.
Set expectations on the difference between the team and full org. There was a mindset that, it takes 6 months for a team to change, then so it'll take you about 6.5 months for the entire 5,000 people. We needed to have been much clearer up front that this is going to take a lot longer than that. The parts do not add up to the whole in that situation.
And the last big bright idea for us, the formation of support alliances and culture generators, that was key. We were trying to get a long-lived, sustainable transformation that is still going. It's surviving me stepping out and taking a different opportunity in Red Hat. It'll survive anyone moving within that organization. To understand why people want to go on a change journey, how they want to process it, what supports are available internally and externally. So the likes of the COP is a support alliance, the likes of AWA are support alliances. That is huge for us because it means you're not on your own. And even to be able to turn up to an event like this, watch the chat and resonate with a lot of the comments and thoughts that people have, and to learn something new, right? And I think that's one of the unspoken mantras of our line of work as well. So that's our bright ideas, folks. And we're pretty much done now. So we'll open it for questions that people have any bright ideas or painful lessons. And Arjay, if you switch to the thank you slide, folks will see our email addresses. If you want to reach out and connect, we're happy to share the slides. And that's our talk, folks.
Based on the chat, it looks like there are a lot of questions. We tried to field as many of those as we could as we spoke, or dropping some messages in the chat. But on top of bright ideas, if you have other things that you wanted to raise, feel free to do that now too.
Want to just switch to the next slide so they can see our emails?
Oh, sorry.
There we are.
Thanks.
So we've got Mary who would like to ask a question.
Oh.
Hey, Mary.
Thank you very much, Charlie. For me, I think the concept of time is, I think is more a comment versus a question, I don't know. The concept of time, I think it's something we have all wrestled with in any change transformation or agile transformation. I think people really don't appreciate how long it takes for habits to change. And they think this is something that can happen in 3 months or 6 months. I know you sort of said, you mentioned it in your presentation, but how can we really get leadership on board to know that this is not a tick in the box exercise? This is not just about strategy. This is about changing people, because fundamentally that is what we are trying to do. We're trying to get people to change. It's not about what we do for the most part. It's about who we are and who we are becoming when we talk about transformation. And that does take a long time.
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Mary. I think we were almost there. We had a lot of leaders who were invested and understood that it could take some time, but it wasn't consistent. And I think going back to communications and also just interviewing, having some good conversations with those leaders individually. If Lee and I had been able to have more time to get that mindset common across all of the leaders, I think we would have done well. We also needed to have that then communicated up and down the entire stack so that managers, members of teams, and everything in between, everybody was hearing the same message. But I love that. If we go back to habits, like how long does it take for a habit to really become ingrained? That's a good mindset.
I think what is a complicating factor is all of those people were working on different products. So if you were a company like, I'm going to say Workday or Salesforce, that are almost a singular product, albeit they probably have a lot of sub teams within that, it's easier to get total alignment. Whereas we're dealing with 40, 50, 60 products and emerging products, and that leads to organizational changes where we realign, we move reporting lines, we merge product areas, and all of those are day-to-day business decisions that we're often not exposed to, and it's a reactive change. Whereas if this was a singular product company, I think a lot of the pain points we had might be mitigated. I don't think they disappear, right? I think the advice we've given is general enough for any large enterprise. But yeah, what the question you asked, if someone can solve that and market it, you could pretty much retire in a year. Because to go back to the lean statistic earlier, under 10% of lean organizations have had a successful transformation, and they're at this for 100+ years.
Thanks.
See,
Fortune. Also, Fortune, yeah.
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Just wanted to make sure. So I'm very interested in your reference to Toyota and to lean. Of course, if we're going to speak of the Toyota situation, the ultimate Toyota book on transformation, of course, was recently written by John Shook, the famous, American Toyota expert, with Deland Kelly, the woman who used John Shook's principles to completely change the world's largest railroad, Union Pacific. And it took her 10 years to do so. And she used a very interesting mix of lean principles. So I'd like to suggest that book to you. It's called Change Questions by Deland Kelly and John Shook. I think that would, they even tell you how to hold the workshops with leadership to get the kind of engagement and time understanding that you seek. So that's my advice to you. My second question, of course, is catchball. When you talk about the communication challenges that you have at each level, how did you engage or rely upon the concept, the lean concept of catchball? Because that's exactly how lean leaders solve this, Chinese whispers problem of the change of communication at each level, which you do, of course, along with the famous Toyota kata coaching. So you need both the kata coaching at all levels in the virtuous cycle with catchball. Did you ever have a chance to try that? Did you?
Yeah, so had Arjay not hacked my slides, right, for the ODF, I had about 8 slides on Hoshin Kanri. That's catchball in the more formal sense for it. The ODF is based on Hoshin Kanri, they just didn't realize it. So we use that as a mechanism to look at putting ideas down, bringing it back up, all of the open comms, the forums we had. This was definitely something that we looked at. And we had it without naming it as a process. But what I love there is your awareness of lean, the Toyota production system, all of the methods, the approaches. I'm going to leave a link in something. The Shingo model was something I was informally following. I think anyone here that has a gap in knowledge around lean should really take the time to explore things like the Shingo model, systems thinking, the catchball concepts. They are all digestible and abstractable enough to apply to your team, to your problem, to your situation. But great observation on the connections, and definitely from a strategic alignment, catchball was what we were trying to do. But time will tell whether we've actually achieved that or not. But the ODF is Hoshin Kanri at a 101 level.
My last comment again is that none of the lean tools work without the Toyota Kata coaching. And so I hope that you have a chance to implement that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can't have, that's that disconnected, which is why we invested with AWA on sending 10 of our folks into a deep coaching mindset to start creating that bud to flower eventually, right, into being that level of coaches. So that's the journey we're on at the moment.
Lee, thanks for saying that about that's the journey we're on at the moment, clarifying that. Yeah, this isn't done. It didn't just end. We're in the process of this, and it's evolving. It's continuing. Any other questions?
I just dropped a link in there to a talk I've done on Hoshin Cannery and the open decision framework for anyone trying to catch up on the lean side of things. It was for a local lean meetup.
So we've got Richard Collins who would like to ask a question.
Hi, a really interesting session. I mean, it's so rare to hear a warts and all presentation, and I think it's 1,000 times more valuable than we walked on water, we cleared buildings, single bound presentations that are typical. So thank you very much for that, much appreciated. The question I was going to ask is whether you've one of the things you talked about was your sort of network of process, and I wonder whether you've come across adaptive spaces, which is the work of Michael Arena and Mary Orbeen, because particularly the former, I mean, he came out of General Motors, which is a small company you might have heard of, in terms of how to do change. And what he talks about is the role of networks as a mechanism for facilitating change and how powerful they can be. And I think your story had a lot there in terms of how networks work for you as a mechanism for sort of triggering culture change and so on in a way that I think you don't get through top-down processes. So if you haven't come across it, there's Michael Arena's written a book, and if you Google Mary Orbeen, she's got some real, because the other thing she talks about is the role of conflict in change processes. And she talks about creating a process of conflicting and connecting, that there will always be conflict in any change process, but that can actually be a constructive thing. And if you can get that process of finding the connections right, you actually get something come out of the change process that, and again, I think some of what you were saying reflected that more than the sum of the parts. It's not a either or, it's a both and process. But anyway, but thank you
really
very
appreciate
much.
that. Yeah, thank you, Richard. Yeah, I'm going to look at that book. I have not read it. Lee might have, but I know I haven't, and
No.
be
Sounds
adding it to the
interesting
list.
though. Definitely something I have the Amazon UK page open with the book in front of me now, so I go on a talk and I spend money.
Yeah, every time. I think we're at 9 o'clock.
Okay.
Is that time, Charlie?
Yeah, I think that's time.
Apologize.
But thank you all for joining this talk, and thank you, Lee and Arjay, for all of your insights. I loved every minute, and like Richard said, sharing the warts and all is just a really, really great way for everyone here to learn and everyone to share their experiences too. So thank you both so much for putting it together, and and thank you to everyone for joining. The recording will be shared on our YouTube channel, and I'll post it on our meetup site later this week.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for the wonderful engagement. Really, really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you all for all the great comments too. I'm going to make sure I get those comments. I'm going to copy and paste them all right now.